We continue now our State of Latino America with one of the most pivotal issues on the agenda. The question is immigration reform finally attainable? This has to be one of the burning questions for America's 60 million plus Latinos and so many others. To conduct that session, LULAC's Senior Policy Director, Vanessa Cárdenas.
Good morning. My name is Vanessa Cárdenas, and I am Senior Advisor at the League of United Latin American Citizens. And I am so glad to be welcoming this panel with such amazing women leaders who are advocates both at the national and state level. And obviously, immigration policy is a key issue for our community, and it is something that we are all looking forward to engage this year. So please help me in welcoming Monica Sarmiento, Executive Director of the Virginia Immigrant Rights Coalition, Darcy Gallego, Legislative Associate of the Immigration Hub, and Claudia Flores, Immigration Campaign Manager at the Center for American Progress. You can learn more about these amazing women at our website. Their biographies are there. The biographies are long because they are so accomplished. So I will point you to the website to learn more about them. So ladies, let's, again, thank you for joining us, and let's start with the conversation. So obviously, immigration policy, immigration reform, the range of immigration issues have been sort of front and center for progressives in general, but for immigrant communities in particular. And now we have a Democratic president. The House is squarely in Democratic hands. The Senate, we are in good shape there. So the question becomes, what we can expect this year. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the executive orders that we have seen in the last few weeks from President Biden. As you all know, in the last probably 2-3 weeks, ever since he took office, he has been rolling out a series of executive orders to protect dreamers, stop deportations, etc. And I wanted to ask, what's your assessment of these executive orders we have seen so far? Is President Biden keeping his promises? And, what has been sort of your reaction this last couple of weeks, seeing all of these actions from the White House? And Claudia, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Vanessa, for having me. I am very excited to be here. I think it's very encouraging what we have seen thus far from the Biden administration. In his very first day in office, President Biden issued a series of executive orders, and among those were executive orders on immigration. This has been a really bold and I would say aggressive stance given where we were for the past 4 years. We have seen, I think, up to date about 29 or so executive orders that he has signed. And on immigration particularly, there are several things that he has done that have mandated top to bottom review of some of the most harmful policies that we saw under the Trump administration. But also we saw his new vision for immigration reform, which is his Day One bill. And that was really important because in that bill, there are several provisions that would, one, create a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants who live in this country, but it would also create legal pathways for dreamers and farm workers. We know that across the country, there's about 5 million estimated undocumented essential workers. Among them are 200,000 DACA recipients who are on the front lines, and also the farm workers that are keeping our nation's food supply and country running. So what we are seeing right now, I think it's a very complete rebuke of the Trump administration's policies on immigration. There are several things that President Biden, and during his campaign, he promised that he would do. And he's meeting those promises, specifically on some of the executive orders, for instance, on public charge. President Biden said that that will be one of the first things that he would get rid of. He has ordered a review of the public charge rule. And, that's really encouraging. We know that public charge has remained in effect after ongoing litigation. And while it is currently in effect, and I do want to clarify that some of these changes will take time, it is currently under review by the administration, and therefore the agency is going to have to review its interpretation of the regulation. So We are seeing that he is making immigration a priority. There are several things at the border that he's also addressed, trying to foster a more regular migration process so that we can begin to rebuild the asylum process that we know was deeply harmed under the Trump administration. So overall, I think that President Biden has shown commitment. I think the real challenge now is trying to make those commitments be implemented, right, and come into practice. So that's where advocates like myself and many others who have joined me on this panel are going to be working with the administration to make sure that we begin to rebuild and also reassess some of the deep damages that we have seen over the past 4 years to our immigration system.
Thank you, Claudia. And could you, for those who are watching who might not know what the public charge rule, could you give us 1 minute overview of it?
Sure. So the public charge rule is probably one of the most damaging policies out of the Trump administration. And this basically impose a wealth test on immigrants. So anyone who used certain benefits could have been barred from obtaining a green card. So this is something that even with its first announcement, it created a lot of fear and had a chilling effect on immigrants across the country. It has prevented people from accessing benefits that their children may be eligible for. And it created a lot of chaos for some of the agencies that are working with low-income families. So this is definitely big news that the Biden administration has decided to review this policy, but we still know that there is that chilling effect in the community where people have fear accessing benefits from the government, even if they're eligible for them because of this public charge rule.
And Monica, I want to turn to you now to get a sense from you. You're in Virginia. Obviously, there's a huge and a very active infrastructure of immigrant rights organizations. How are you receiving sort of these executive orders, and sort of what is the reaction that you're seeing both from organizations on the ground and people on the ground that have been waiting, for the last 4 years for some sort of relief?
Of course. So we've seen a great deal of mobilization from a variety of communities. As you know, the Virginia Coalition for Immigrant Rights does a great deal of diversity in the ground. So what we've done is really organize so many organizations that this is their first time at the table, really looking at what we can go ahead and do in the creation of a pathway to citizenship. We understand that obviously this is a great first step with the administration, but there's still so many key things that need to be done to really elevate equity within our community that the administration still has to do. So there's still a great push, not only for accountability from community members to the administration, but also having those conversations with elected officials, members of Congress, senators, that we are also standing and saying that they need to go ahead and do more, but also hold the administration continuously accountable for all the needs that need to be done in the community. All politics always ends up being local, so that local representation is absolutely a key factor in a state that is the former home of the Confederacy. So, it was only 2017 that we had the neo-Nazis marching down on Charlottesville. But now we're still seeing, how that community activism is turning out and local power to really create this surge of demand of what is long overdue. So the executive orders are an excellent start, but there's still a long way to go.
I think we all agree with that. It's just the beginning. I want to talk a little bit about the bill that Biden sent to Congress that Claudia mentioned. But before that, I wanted to talk about the significance of having someone like Alejandro Mayorkas as DHS secretary. As I think most of us were watching earlier this week, he finally got confirmed. And that's, again, he will be the first Latino to be in that post. So I'm wondering, Darcy, if you had any reactions for his nomination and confirmation.
Sure, and thank you so much, Vanessa, first for having me, LULAC for hosting this event, and your entire team for putting this great panel together. As for Alejandro Mayorkas' nomination, we are deeply encouraged and really looking forward to working with him. Mayorkas is a civil servant who has served this country for decades now. He's been a staunch advocate for immigrant communities. Most notably, he was at the helm of the implementation of the DACA program when it first came out. And we know from his confirmation hearings and conversations that advocates have had with him that he's prepared to really undo the really irreparable harm that this past administration put on our communities, and the pain that's still being felt right now, right? And so I just want to, also uplift that while we're seeing really encouraging signs from this administration, we're really looking forward to working with folks in the administration. Want to note the pain that's being felt in the community still, particularly in the Black migrant community. Want to note that despite these really encouraging executive orders, we're still seeing deportations. We're still seeing folks being expelled at the southern border. So we're really looking forward to working with Mayorkas and his team to make sure that we halt deportations, we halt these expulsions at the border, and we really take steps to repair this harm that our communities have been feeling for so long.
Darcy, that's such an important point, because that's actually something that has been playing out the last couple of days, because we have heard about deportations that are happening to Haiti and other places that are particularly affecting the African community. Why? And I think most people are wondering why these are still happening, and even though Biden has said that he will stop deportations.
Yeah, certainly. It's challenging to reckon with a little bit, right? Because we think a lot of us thought that by the administration coming into power, there'd be an immediate shift. But as Claudia alluded to earlier, unfortunately, some of these things take time. Just to be frank, the Department of Homeland Security isn't fully staffed yet. We just saw Mayorkas' nomination this week. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time. And then just particularly to the deportations, a lot of these were scheduled, unfortunately, during the Trump administration. And what we're seeing is ICE field offices are carrying out these deportations despite guidance being different from the administration. So inherently, there's a bit of a disconnect there between the administration, what we're hearing from the White House, and what folks in these field offices are doing. So it's going to take a little bit of time, but I think that's where it's so important to bring in this public pressure and this awareness, and to make sure that we're all doing our part to elevate these issues and to ensure that the administration understands that we will not accept this, right? We understand that it takes time, but this harm that's going on right now has to be stopped.
And I think that also speaks to Monica's point about holding the administration accountable. So I think that's a really important point. I want to turn now to the actual bill that Biden sent to Congress. Obviously, we've heard a little bit about it, but I was wondering how this bill is different from the ones we have seen before. How do you guys think it has an actual chance, this Congress? And I don't know, Darcy, you want to kick us off, and then we can go to Claudia, or?
Sure, happy to get us started. Just want to note the significance of the Biden administration putting forth this package literally on the first day. It sends a really bold, visionary message, not only to our communities, right, that have fought for decades for this and in large part led him to be in the White House in the first place, but also sends a really strong message to Congress that this is a priority for the administration. So we are certainly encouraged. Right now, the way I think of it, it's almost our gold star. It's what we're looking toward, right? It's our ultimate goal of securing legalization for the full 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. And that's precisely what the bill does and why we're so encouraged by it. Other, really encouraging provisions in the bill, we haven't seen text quite yet, but from what we've noted from the outlines is it would, address root causes of migration as well. It kind of shifts the paradigm of how we talk about the border as opposed to being on border security. It's shifting toward border management and really taking into account border communities. Also looks into addressing immigration courts, into really reforming and building off of, the asylum system, the refugee system. It seems like a very comprehensive approach. And just want to note that what sets this package apart from previous packages that we've seen in the early 2000s, latest being in 2013, is it notably does not include enforcement up front. And that's really important for our communities, especially coming out of these 4 years where we saw attack after attack. We saw a ballooning of the amount of money that was allocated to ICE and CBP to inflict harm on our communities. So the fact that the first, indication out of this administration is bold, does not include enforcement, is really encouraging.
That's a really important point, because obviously in past legislation, we have seen a real emphasis on enforcement as well. So Claudia, what makes you hopeful about this bill? You know, what are the things that jump out at you as things that are different from before?
Yeah, so I think, as Darcy mentioned, yeah, it is important that the bill doesn't begin with trade-offs, which has been the problem. And I think that's why many in the advocacy community had turned into other types of reform, and not just this whole idea of comprehensive immigration reform, which has been sort of the legislative approach for many years. I do think that, there are important considerations with this bill. We know that there were tremendous gains that were made by Democrats over the recent election, and that resulted in a majority in the Senate. But the Senate is really where the play is at. I think, Biden has put forth this vision bill. Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey is tasked with the introduction of that bill in the Senate. And then on the House side, we have Representative Linda Sanchez from California, who has promised to be the one leading this effort. So we have champions, I think, on both ends. I think the challenge with a bill like this is that you have to get to the 60 votes because of the filibuster that exists in the Senate. And this is where I think folks who are, watching may have been hearing about these whole talks about the budget and reconciliation and a push for essential workers. And the idea here is that advocates are looking at multiple fronts to get immigration reform done. We do know that we have a broken system. We haven't seen reform of our immigration system in more than 30 years. And at the same time, while Congress has failed to provide these permanent pathways and address the legalization of folks who are in the United States and those future flows of migrants, the enforcement system, right, that we've been talking, this massive deportations, massive detention that we see has continued to rise, funded by our very own US Congress. So the idea here, and I think what groups are looking at, is different strategies, right? The budget reconciliation process has been sort of the talk of the town right now in DC, because it's a process that allows the majority party or the party in control to pass a budget resolution in an expedited way and with a simple majority of 51 votes, which means that Democrats would have exactly the votes that they need to get something done. So it's been utilized throughout history, basically, to get some very big, I would say sometimes partisan legislation through. We saw it, for instance, Democrats utilized the reconciliation process for healthcare reform. We also saw Republicans utilize it for tax cuts. So each party that has been in control in the Senate has utilized this process to get some priorities through. Now, on immigration, we know it's actually very interesting because both the senators from Virginia sit on the budget committee, and this is the committee that would be determining sort of the rules of the process. So it's very important that your senators, specifically Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, are very much hearing this pressure and this importance of including legalization for workers in some of these provisions, because they ultimately have some say in this process. But that is one avenue that I think, given COVID relief and given the statements that President Biden has said and what we saw last night, the Senate had very late night votes looking specifically. It looks like the reconciliation process is going to move. There are some conversations that Democrats may consider a second package, because we know that there are so many issues that need to be addressed. So I think the public pressure needs to continue so that folks are hearing that we want immigration to be part of like a bold and inclusive economic recovery package, because as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, undocumented immigrants have been running this country for many years. They are part of the essential workforce. They are contributing now. They've been essential for many, many years, even before this pandemic, and they're going to be essential to a nation's recovery. So that is one of the legislative strategies. Obviously, we would like to see the President Day One vision bill come materialize, but we know that it's going to be challenging, because in order to get that done, you would need to get 9 Republicans to come on board to support that bill. And I think that's where we get into some of those trade-offs and some potential bills where it may, some of these protections may come in exchange for more enforcement. And those are things that ultimately harm our community. So there's a lot to see. I think we are mostly encouraged that we have an administration that is willing to work on this and has made it a priority. And that for once, we are not being bombarded pretty much with, executive orders and rules that are really trying to harm the community. We're actually hoping that it's the other way, right? We're hoping that President Biden utilizes every branch of government, including the agencies. Folks typically don't know that the immigration courts are housed under the Department of Justice. So there's a lot that President Biden can also do to remove some of these court backlogs that are impacting people and are preventing many folks from adjusting or dealing with some of their deportation cases. So there's a lot that can happen over the next few years. And because we know that 2022 is a big year for election, President Biden technically has these 2 very important years to get immigration reform across the finish line.
That's a lot, and we could go many routes from what you just laid out. But I want to bring Monica in here and ask her: has the bill, as outlined by the White House, fulfilled your expectations, Monica, in terms of what you wanted to see from Biden, and now that we have seen what he's proposing?
So this year we represent a very broad coalition that, has at the table different ethnicities, different groups, refugee communities. So we will always seek the most broadest possible initiative. And we're looking at many vehicles. Of course, we're excited about the Biden proposal, but we're also looking to be as inclusive of the refugee community as possible and other communities to kind of move that forward. And I think, Claudia hit the nail on the head. This is going to take a mobilization of Congress to move forward. I mean, personally, my family, my grandmother, God rest her soul, was able to go ahead and get a pathway to citizenship to Ronald Reagan's Amnesty Act. And he did that with a Democratic Congress. And that created a pathway to citizenship for my family. And I think the reality of that is that we once again have to look at Congress and really make sure that we look at every vehicle possible, which is why, we've continuously had conversations with both Senator Warner and Senator Kane's office, and continuous conversations with multiple members of Congress on what possible vehicles are available to get as many pathways available to as many communities as possible, as inclusive as possible. So although we're excited about the Biden plan, it's just that the Biden plan, and we have to be realist about this. 9 Republicans is a lot of votes to come up with a constituency that has really been oppressive to the immigrant community in a number of facets. And although we have been able to go ahead and see some bipartisan support in some avenues, we haven't seen it in the way that we've needed for so long. And of course, both parties are at fault because, there's so many policies that have been put in place from the Clinton administration that we're still suffering under with the 310 rule. So there's a number of areas that we need to look at, but we need to continue that local mobilization, looking at all avenues, fight for the Biden plan, but also be realists about it and fight for any avenue that's available.
Monica, I definitely want to talk a little bit about sort of your state level efforts and how you guys have done that work to bring relief. But I want to go back to sort of the national perspective and talk a little bit about some of the bills that we have seen. For example, Senator Durbin just a couple of days introduced the DREAM Act, which again would bring relief to so many DACA recipients and dreamers. And I wanted to just get a little bit of a sense from Darcy about what you expect on that front and how is that vehicle going to move forward?
Sure. So the DREAM Act being introduced is certainly a part of one of the trains, right? One of the approaches that we're going with. And I'll just back up a little bit and explain a little bit more on that. That train we're kind of noting as the regular order train, which consists of bringing bills that have previously been introduced to the floor again for votes in the House and in the Senate together. So the DREAM Act on the Senate side is a really important step forward for us. Durbin has been a champion for immigrant communities for decades. We're really encouraged by his work on this. And I want to note that what sets the DREAM Act apart is its bipartisan nature. So he introduced it along with Senator Graham from South Carolina. So that's really important, right? Because as we talk about bringing pieces of legislation to the Senate floor and understanding that we need those Republicans on board, it's an important step to bringing Republicans to the table, with the important caveat, right, that we want to be really careful of not having those trade-offs, right? So it's almost a delicate balance here, but this is a strong indication that our members of Congress are also hearing from us and understanding that immigration really is a priority. So the fact that we're starting to move bills is really important. Separately on the House side, we're also expecting to see the HR 6 The Dream and Promise Act move as well. The Farm Worker Modernization Act, we're expecting those to move forward. Those are more progressive pieces of legislation, certainly, that also have some bipartisan support in the House. So we hope to also move those bills to the House floor. We hope that with passage of those bills, we pressure the Senate to be more progressive in their own proposals. A note on the DREAM Act is that it only addresses current DACA recipients and folks who would be eligible for DACA. It doesn't address TPS and it doesn't address farm workers, right? So we're hoping that if the House is able to pass those bills again, we're signaling that beyond Dreamers, we really need to address at the minimum TPS holders and farm workers as well. There's efforts to move the Secure Act, which is Senator Van Hollen's bill, on the Senate side on TPS. And we're hoping, that as these bills get introduced, we'll then see some conversations. We'll hopefully see a markup in the next month or so. And that ultimately, when it comes to the floor, it's a package that we can all, rally around and support that's more inclusive than just a DREAM Act.
That's great and super helpful, Darcy. Thank you. So we have been talking a lot about the national stuff, but obviously states across the country have been doing also a lot of work to bring relief to communities. And I wanted to turn it back to Monica to tell us a little bit more about some of the efforts like in Virginia that organizations have engaged with to help communities, and also just how you guys are organizing to pressure, for example, your senators who are going to play such an important role in the debate.
I think, first and foremost, we have to acknowledge there's no such thing as an overnight success, although sometimes it feels that way. And in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we made huge strides in the last state session with the passing of in-state tuition for Dreamers, as well as driving access for undocumented Virginians, making it unlawful for law enforcement to, ask what their people's immigration status is. All of these things have taken a great deal of mobilization from organizations who have been decades on the ground providing direct services. On the growing immigrant community, Virginia is now the 9th largest immigrant community in the United States that continues to grow. So it has taken a lot of work and a lot of years to really bring validation and a voice to this movement and a unification that was needed, and also understanding that we needed champions on the ground to really voice for us and people who reflect our values. And I think for us, we're very fortunate with Delegate Alfonso Lopez, who is one of our communities representing us as the Democratic Whip, and then of course other champions like Delegate Kathy Tran, and of course on the Senate side, people like Senator Jennifer Boysko, on the state level, and understanding that politics is local and equity starts at home. And being able to go ahead and see how those differences really impact on what local and state government have to, the local community. And I think, I was very fortunate to grow up both in Northern Virginia and in Southern California. So I had a firsthand look of how different life can be for the immigrant when it comes to how government treats you. And so being able to go ahead and really push to those strides, we are able to go ahead and organize with, we have 39 member organizations and well over 100 organizations like CASA and NACASEC and New Virginia Majority, Legal Aid Justice Center, long list of organizations to coming together and really fighting at multiple levels. And, Vasir being the convener. So it is work, it is constant convening, it is boots on the ground, and understanding that it does take a great deal of community organizing and field work. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not the most glamorous thing in the world, but this is really what mobilizes and changes policies. And for us to go, what I said earlier, 2017, I think all eyes were on Virginia, neo-Nazis marching down the streets, just the oppression that was held. And even now, our state capital still has so many remnants of the Confederacy, the Northern Virginia General Lee Battalion flag that is nationally recognized as the Confederate flag comes from the Commonwealth and is still flown all over the state. So all of those mixed divergence, it takes a lot of time and effort to really talk to community members, find those stories, take that courage, and mobilize people to go ahead and work with local and state officials to make those changes happen. And even, there were years, many, many years, that we had advocates go down to state session and they were rejected over and over and over again. But finally, with enough mobilization, there was a window and we were able to be victorious for a community that has been in desperate need and oppressed for so long. And so even though we had a federal government that was being excruciatingly offensive and oppressive to the undocumented community, we were able to see laws signed in and change effectively happen during that administration, during the Trump administration, to bring change. And, this has really sown the seeds to show that we are a force to be reckoned with. And that we are not standing alone. We were out there with the huge diversity of Basir, with the African community, the Asian community, all coming out, but then finding all sorts of allies standing with us and saying immigrant rights matter, refugee rights matter, and we need to make that change here. And that has also created a platform for us to be able to carry that mobilization, that visible mobilization, to the federal side. Because when you go ahead and make those kind of substantial changes, people take notice. They take notice of what has happened. They take notice of the acknowledgement. And that also continuously opens doors for us. And not just on the Democratic side, but with Republicans as well, where we sit down and talk about, what they need to be doing to move forward regarding finally a pathway to citizenship for people in their community who are their constituents, their tax-paying constituents, regardless of immigration status.
And thank you, Monica, for all of that. And I think you bring really important points to the table, because I do feel like there's such optimism, cautious optimism right now, right? But I think the reality is that Republicans are very divided, to say the least, right? And even though Democrats control now both the House and the Senate, as Claudia mentioned earlier, the play is going to be in the Senate, and we are going to need Republican votes. So maybe, Claudia, you want to sort of help us understand a little bit about who these Republicans are and how realistic it is to expect that they're going to vote for reform or any type of positive and affirmative relief for our communities.
Definitely. So I think for the Republican Party, there are several tests on how much they can come to the table when it comes to immigration. We saw most recently the introduction of the Bipartisan DREAM Act. Protections for Dreamers has been an issue that receives overwhelming support by voters on both sides of the aisle. So this is an opportunity and really a test to see whether Republicans can come to the table on issues that have such support, not just from their constituency, but also in terms of bipartisan leadership in Congress. So I think that, the Republican Party, I think within some of the folks that we typically hear from, we know that Senator Graham is already a co-sponsor of the DREAM Act. He's someone that has said that he's willing to work on this specific issue. We also have other Republicans in some states, for instance, in Texas, Senator Cornyn. These are states that have immigrant constituencies, so they feel the pressure internally to act on some of these issues. We also have senators like Tillis from North Carolina, who has said that he would support protections for Dreamers and potentially other immigrants. We also have the Republicans that feel the heat based on re-election. We have in the past typically worked with Marco Rubio from Florida. We know that Florida is always a key state for elections. But we do know that Marco Rubio has a re-election in 2022. So we have seen some of the political posturing coming from him already. We saw some of his statements around the nomination of Secretary Alan Mayorkas. So it seems like Senator Marco Rubio is trying to right now pander to the base that President Trump left. So I think it's going to be really interesting because some of the folks that we have typically worked with on immigration issues, I think are facing this pressure to figure out which base of the Republican Party they're really catering to. But I think there are some opportunities on some issues. I think protecting Dreamers, definitely one that gets a lot of support. Farm workers, I think there's more recognition, especially with the pandemic, that farm workers have been keeping our nation's food supply, our communities running. And I think for some of these senators in some of these red states, I mean, they get a lot of pressure from the growers, from the agricultural, the lobbyists from that sector, because, these are key sectors in our economy. Some of the, I would say, allies that are usually non-traditional in the immigration space, but who have played a big role, continue to be the chambers. Because the chambers of commerce obviously feel the pressure. They know that these are workers that they need. So these are folks that can come and work together and also, pressure some of these Republican senators to work with Democrats to get some things done. So I think there are some things that are possible. Obviously, timing is always the big factor. But I think for advocates, what has changed is that, we're not going into the CIR approach. And I think that has for many years sometimes prevented things from getting done, because when you go into an all or nothing approach, I think we've seen over the years, we've ended up pretty much with nothing. And, the urgency in the community hasn't gone away. So there are key pieces of legislation that I am optimistic can move. And I think we should be holding both parties accountable, but especially the Republican Party, because if we only need 9 votes, identifying who those 9 could be, and also watching out, I think, for Democrats that tend to be more on the moderate side. I know the state of Arizona is a key player. We have both Sinema and Kelly. They need to be hearing that this is a priority. Arizona is a tough state, but it's also a state that has seen immigration play such a big role. So these are folks that we need to be watching out for. And I think your senators in Virginia play a huge role. Their committee assignments are huge on budget, but also because Senators Tim Kaine and Warner have worked across the aisle, and they have all these relationships also with other moderate Democrats. So they're going to be key voices in the immigration debate.
I really want to emphasize, Claudia, what you just said about the importance of making sure that Democratic senators are also on our side. So states like Arizona, like you mentioned, are so important, as well as making sure that Republican senators that in the past have worked in a bipartisan way also remain on our side. And that's going to require a lot of engagement at the state level to lean in on the senators. But I also want to go back to the point that you were making about essential workers, and was just hoping that maybe you can tell us whether you think that it might be possible that they might be included in the next COVID relief bill. And maybe Darcy, you can also weigh in here.
So I think they should, Vanessa. I think, the pressure needs to be extremely high, especially over the next few days. Some of this is going to come at the direction of the White House. So they need to be hearing from multiple constituencies that this is something that we want. Essential workers, as I mentioned, are going to be critical for the nation's recovery. But it's also, I think, frankly, a slap to the face to not include them in some of these packages, because these are the people that have been on the front line supporting our communities. And they need protection. Having a pathway to legalization would allow these essential workers to have some security. We also know that the majority of essential workers are people of color, and people of color have been feeling the disproportionate impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, these are the folks, especially among the Latino community. Our community has been hurt deeply by COVID. And if we can't protect them, I think we are not being truthful about a pathway that would lead us to a future that's more equitable, that's more just. So the White House needs to be hearing from us that this is important. I think we need to be pressuring some of the senators to hear from this, especially those who are on the budget committee, because they are the ones that have the power over this. Senator Bernie Sanders is part of the budget committee. He is actually the head of the committee at this point. So he's going to be a key player in this. So I think the more that they hear that this is a priority, I think the better chances we have. But obviously we have to see what happens. It's going to be a challenge regardless. And I want to add that it's not the only way to get protections for some of these workers, but it is an opportunity that we have now. And it's certainly one that we would hope the White House and other of our champions will take.
Great. Darcy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo everything that Claudia said, how absolutely important it is that we do everything in our power to push for these important protections for essential workers in this next package. Just want to, maybe for folks who are listening and explain a little bit about reconciliation back up. What we had mentioned kind of at the onset is this week, there are discussions and votes were taking place on the first COVID-19 reconciliation package, and we're expecting a second one to come in a couple of months. That'll timing of that, obviously speculative at this point, but we're thinking later this spring. So it's important that right now we start that pressure. We continue that pressure. We're really elevating the fact that we have over 5 million essential workers. Of those, approximately 200,000 DACA recipients. As Claudia said, folks who have been at the front line, who have stepped up for this country, for this economy, and who will be vital in our path forward. So that's why it's so important to build that pressure so that over these next couple of months, these senators are really understanding that this is a priority for us. We want it to be attached onto that second package. That's our ultimate goal. And as Claudia said, it's not the only path, right? We've talked about these different approaches, but it's an important one. And just want to, remind folks again that through this path, we only need a simple majority. So it's really, really important that we keep up the pressure on Democrats, particularly on this. I want to mention the chair of the House Budget Committee as well, Representative Yarmouth. So to the extent that folks can elevate this using their platforms, can communicate with their members, we really need, to keep that drumbeat up and hope that we can really secure those protections for folks in these next couple of months.
Great. Thank you, ladies. And I know we're almost running out of time, so I want to ask my last question, and it's a two-part question. So the first part is, why do you think this year is possible to achieve immigration reform? And the next part of the question is, how can people plug into the costs, both at either at the state level or at the national level? So Monica, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So, I think, first and foremost, we finally know who the players on the game are, and we know what their histories are regarding immigration reform and how they feel. So I think, based on history, we know what the potential outcome is. Hence, we all feel that there really is a strong chance now to move forward and seeing a number of bills kind of come into fruition and finally give a pathway to our to citizenship to our community. So I think, it depends on the individual. If there is a local organization in your area that is already doing that kind of activism and work, my suggestion is to immediately plug in with them. And of course, always keep looped into the amazing national organizations like Center for American Progress and LULAC, who are also doing this work nationally. But, as someone who's working in Virginia, I cannot overemphasize the importance of constituency and how this is always the first avenue of defense for our community, and making sure that we have constituents out meeting with elected officials. It's always going to hit different when you have 100 constituents calling a member of Congress or calling a senator, because this is home. And I also want to emphasize, regardless of political affiliation, you should still be meeting with that elected official. And even in regards to our neighboring states, I think like North Carolina, that actually has a larger immigrant community than Virginia does, just because historically they haven't, those electeds haven't always been on the side. Demographics change. And what we've learned is when those demographic changes happen in those communities that those elected officials have long represented, sometimes you're able to go ahead and get a window there, specifically because they see the demographics of that community changing. And those elected officials want to keep their seats. They want to get reelected. And, these people will have to vote for him or her in order to go ahead and send them back. And so that has been important, and that has been important in Virginia in the past when we've seen so many elected officials and also our member organizations work across the aisle with really surprising partners to move legislation forward. So don't let that stop you, and always try to get as many constituents as possible. And every voice matters, and personal stories in the district matter. So that is absolutely what I would suggest.
Thank you. Claudia, you want to go next?
Sure. I think the reason I'm optimistic about immigration reform being possible is because we have new leadership. I think that when voters came out and showed up at the polls and said, these policies are not working, it was a complete revocation of the Trump policies that had been a failure to the community. So I think that is the opportunity that we have to hold some of these leaders accountable, because the American public gave them a mandate, and that mandate is to make some of these changes. And I think folks broadly agree that this system needs reform. So I'm keeping myself very optimistic. One of the causes that is very dear to my heart as a DACA recipient is obviously protections for dreamers. In Virginia alone, there's about 10,000 DACA recipients. There are many things that can happen at the federal level, but also at the state level. I mean, we saw that, Virginia, thanks to the work of people like Monica and so many others here, I mean, they were able to obtain driver's licenses. We saw the big gains with in-state tuition for undocumented students. And now we are seeing that, recently 2 bills have passed the House and the Senate that would provide more financial aid for undocumented students. I mean, these are taxpayers. These are folks that the state has already invested. So these are urgencies that our community has, and that can also really impact the quality of life for immigrant families in Virginia and across the nation. So I'm staying optimistic. I'm staying engaged. My day-to-day work requires me, I think, to be plugged in. But I think for folks that are listening in, you're a young person who are tuning in. I mean, you have a lot of power. Your voice can really shape some of this debate, whether it's meeting with someone, whether it's collecting stories, sharing your own story, your family story, and just being aware. I think getting some information out there. There's a lot of disinformation in the Latino community that's being spread right now. So I think just being very attentive to what's being said. And knowing that you belong here and that this is also your community. So your needs need to be addressed by some of these politicians.
Thank you. And Darcy, you get us the last word.
Just want to echo everything that Monica and Claudia said, and really want to emphasize that the fact that we're even having this discussion is a testament to the work of organizers on the ground, like Monica, folks who have been working for decades on these issues. Want to credit also the Black and Brown organizers that delivered this victory for the Biden-Harris administration, and echoing again, this is a mandate. Right. This is our moment, and don't want to be overly optimistic. Right. We have so many, obstacles and variables to weigh, as we've discussed in this panel, but it is really our time right now. We have, suffered for 4 years, folks in our communities. Some did not make it through these 4 years. And I think that's something that, I carry with me every day in this work, is that we might have made it. But folks, died in detention. Folks were deported, separated from families. It's important that we never forget those things, right? And so keeping that at the forefront, elevating your own narrative, it is incredibly important. And holding these members accountable. As we've said, there are so many different tracks that are going to be moving in these next couple of months. Pay attention. That's my number one, piece of advice to young folks listening in right now. If you're not too engaged in the political process, don't really understand how Congress works, plug in. This is the time really to watch, to use your platforms. Folks on social media, young people have so much power on social media. Get your friends to write letters to Congress, make calls to your Congress members, plug into your local organizations. There's really so much to do. And I think this is really the time to plug in. So I'm really looking forward to what we can get done in this next year, hopefully.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to end this wonderful session with a lot of optimism, but also a call to action for our community to really be plugged in. LULAC is going to be holding Hill visits along with the summit. So that is going to be an opportunity for folks to be able to actually engage with the lawmakers that are going to be making these decisions in the next couple of months. So I want to thank you ladies so much, Monica, Claudia, and Darcy. Thank you again for being part of this conversation, and we hope to see you again in other LULAC programs. And I want to thank the audience for listening in, and hopefully you have learned a lot about immigration and what we expect in the next few months. And our call, again, is to plug in, connect through LULAC or your state level organization. Thank you.